course, as you know, many voices that need to be heard on the budget, particularly on a day in which VAT goes up by 0.5 percentage point. Also, a lot more money being spent on infrastructure. Busisiwe Mavuso is the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. Busi, good evening. Plenty of political parties opposing the VAT increase tonight. Are you going to join them?
No, I was going to rate this budget as 7 had it not been for the VAT increase. So it's rather unfortunate, especially when you look at the fact that the average South African consumer is under immense pressure. So putting on a 1%, and by the way, he says 0.5% now and 0.5% next year, possibly. I can tell you now that 0.5% next year is a guarantee. It's not a possibly. I think it just didn't want to put it all at once, because it didn't want to shock people and didn't want to upset people. But I think what really stood out for me and what was quite encouraging, Stephen, was the 4 pillars on which economic growth is anchored. He speaks about maintaining macroeconomic stability, he speaks about implementing structural reforms, accelerating infrastructure investment, and improving state capability. If we really want to achieve, he speaks about 1.8%, but remember the business-government partnership at the beginning of the year spoke about 3% economic growth. And it was really anchored on these things, especially the infrastructure investment, which is going to be coming from transmission, 14,000 of transmission lines that have to actually be put up. I think we're planning to put up about 2,000 this year. The improvements that is going to be made on transport and logistics, the private sector participation that is actually going to be coming in. The DOT minister has now put up a PSP unit in her office to accelerate the facilitation of private sector. They are going to be bringing in a lot of money to upgrade, to improve the efficiency, whatever maintenance that needs to be done on these lines that they're going to be taking over, the water infrastructure, the e-visas that are now in place, which are going to bring in a whole lot of tourism, the generation that, not on the pipeline in terms of the PPPs and the renewables that are actually going to come onto stream. So that is actually quite encouraging. And I actually like the fact, Stephen, that the 1 trillion infrastructure investment is actually going to be focused on these 3 network industries. We've been talking about network industries for quite some time. Energy, transport, logistics, and water, and that is precisely where we need to be focusing if we want to see economic growth. So the plan is a legitimate one and an achievable one.
Sure, but we heard earlier on the Money Show analysis suggesting the problem is always that, yes, the money will be spent on infrastructure, but we don't actually see any return on that investment. We often don't even see the infrastructure.
We actually have to give this kind of investment as well as the structural reform agenda some time. Because remember, just take Transnet, for instance. Look at how much business Transnet has lost to Mauritius, to Namibia, to Mozambique because of their failure to take the goods out on time, in terms of exports and goods sitting in for many weeks, in the ports from an imports perspective. Now, you've lost that business. People have actually established good relations with the other ports, neighboring ports. So do you really think it's going to be an easy a piece of work to try and convince these customers to actually come back? So we need to understand that we actually need to do the work and prove that the work that we've put in place is going to be sustainable. We need to prove that actually the interventions and the reforms that are being put in place are actually going to be sustainable and they are not actually going to leave business, hanging on a ledge once again. So there is that bit to say that you do the investment now, but the trickle effect, is actually going to be seen a few years, into the future. And I think same with the visitors, Stephen. People already have chosen some other countries as investment and probably maybe as tourist destinations. Coming to South Africa is going to be no easy fit. There's going to be a lot of marketing and putting our foot forward that we're going to have to do to try and convince all of those people to come back.
The National Treasury also says that it'll start a review process, a reform process on government spending. Busi, any ideas on where they should start, where government should cut back on spending?
Let's start with reducing the size of the cabinet. Let's start with the huge entourages that all of these ministers and their deputy ministers have. Let's start by defining first, what are deputy ministers for again? What does the success metric look like for them? Because it doesn't make sense that you're going to be spending so much money on keeping people when you actually don't have clarity in terms of what they are meant to achieve and what their jobs are. So if we are going to be all asked to actually ensure that we tighten our belts. Can it start with national, with government, and really putting those things out there and doing some of the things that are actually going to give the rest of us confidence, as it were. But I'm actually not convinced about a committee being set up for wasteful expenditure. What powers is this committee going to have, Stephen? Because something like this needs to be monitored, delivered, done within the department. Because if you're going to be someone sitting out, is it going to be inviting businessmen again like he did? So if I'm going to be sitting on that committee, I'm going to do all of this review. I'm going to write recommendations. How many recommendations, how many papers, how many committees have actually submitted legitimate work to the president? Start with PSEC, SOE reform. That paper that was given said, President, you don't need 743 SOEs, you need 6. And maybe to be honest and maybe to be fair, work is underway to try and see how you bring private sector participation, how you break some of the monopolies. But we have a long history, of committees being set up, recommendations being made, and that not being given effect to, and we don't know what ends up happening in as far as that. So there, I think we're just kicking the can down the road.
Busisiwe Mavuso, thank you very much indeed. CEO at Business Leadership South Africa on The Money Show.